Thanks for tuning in to this special program with journalist and best-selling author Michael Dobbs and Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 25th season. It's been 48 years since the resignation of Richard Nixon after Watergate. Michael Dobbs' new book, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy, is an account in 4 acts of unleashed hubris, sycophancy, and brazen corruption. What's new is thousands of hours of released tape recordings that fill in those first 100 days of Nixon's second term. His book reveals conversations that pull the curtain back on a self-made man desperate to retain his legacy and lofty place in the world. If this all sounds familiar, consider Richard Nixon's fall as a cautionary tale in what can happen to a leader surrounded by loyalists, by those drunk with power and influence, and by those fueled by ambition with no regard to public welfare. Every president keeps a few eccentrics hanging around who help to define his presidency or reveal his weaknesses. I'll only mention 2, but there are so many in this book. Read, for example, about Martha Mitchell for her unfiltered pronouncements often made while drunk. Read about Bibi Rebozo, the president's confidant and closest friend, whose sketchy financial schemes on Nixon's behalf raised eyebrows and whose reckless driving with the president in the front seat and the first family in the back enraged the Secret Service. But it's the drama percolating within the president himself that's so gripping. We see his cunning, his paranoia, and a most complicated man in such an intimate way. Yes, it's familiar. You will have questions. Email them to reservations@writersblockpresents.com and we'll try to get to them. What an embarrassment of riches here today. We have with us 2 unquestionably terrific writers. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and you see him all the time on MSNBC. Before Susan Glasser jumped to the New Yorker, she was the founding editor of Politico. She now writes on the Biden administration, and I bet that comes as sort of a relief after her last 4 years. You see her on CNN. Please visit our website to get a link to Chevalier's books, where you can purchase a copy of Michael Dobbs' great book, King Richard. Thank you so much. Here's Michael Dobbs, Susan Glasser, and Peter Baker.
Well, thank you so much. We're delighted to be doing this conversation today. I have to say, with Michael Dobbs, we are friends and colleagues of Michael's from the Washington Post, where we all worked together and knew each other. And actually, in particular, we can tell you that Michael is not just a great historian and author, but also an amazing foreign correspondent, which is the context I think we really first came to know Michael in, as he was our predecessor in the Post Moscow Bureau, and that informs a lot of his extraordinary work as a historian and writer chronicling the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. And we could talk forever, Michael, about those books as well, if anyone in your audience wants to do that. But Peter and I were so excited, actually, because we've all been obsessed and more inward looking in the last few years. We haven't been thinking about the break of the Soviet Union or even the crisis of democracy in Russia today under Vladimir Putin. We've been thinking about the crisis of democracy here in the United States and the frailties and liabilities and weaknesses of the institution of the American presidency. And that leads us to think about Donald Trump, but also, of course, about Richard Nixon, who's been really top of mind in recent years for many people. There have been a spate of excellent Nixon books. And I have to say, having read many of them, I still found your book to be gripping read and, you know, a real page turner. And so I guess I thought we'd start out with a little bit of that today. Like, maybe you can tell us why you decided to jump into the crowded field of Nixoniana. It's maybe not as crowded as the field of Abraham Lincoln books, but it's certainly a very relevant, if not even more relevant, field of study for those of us who are thinking about the plight of American democracy today.
Right. Well, it's absolutely true. There've been a lot of Watergate books and a lot of Nixon books. And mine is different, I think, because the real subject that interests me was the fall of a president and the unraveling of his presidency. And the whole series of books by a journalist turned historian called Teddy White, called The Making of the President. And I was really focused on the unmaking of the president. I wanted to tell that story. And one can condense it into just a very short period of time, or 3 months, 100 days, that I look at, from Nixon being at the height of his power, and then all the people around him in the White House suddenly start turning on each other and eventually turning on the president. And one can do this from inside the White House. I mean, most of the other books that have been written about Watergate have been written from the outside in. I mean, the classic one, of course, is by our former Washington Post colleague, Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein, All the President's Men, which is the story of two reporters, pursuing their investigation into Watergate and eventually bringing the president down. And it's a great book, but it's from the outside. Now, thanks to all these tapes and other materials we can talk about that have emerged in the last few years, you can really tell this story from the inside. And I don't think it's going to be possible to do this for another American president. I mean, one can try to reconstruct it journalistically, but we're not going to have the tapes and inside sources, or literally, I say, I could be a fly on the wall. In fact, my readers and I become bugs in the desk, because there literally were bugs in the desk in the Oval Office. And this is never going to happen again, because no president is ever going to tape himself the way Nixon did. I think that's safe to say.
Well, Michael, thank you very much from me as well for including us in your book tour, because we're huge fans of Michael's, as Susan said, and have been for years. All of his books have been remarkable on the Cuban Missile Crisis, on Yalta, particularly the end of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union down with Big Brother. This book continues, I think, in that tradition of taking a big moment in history and diving in deep and telling us what it means. And I really appreciate that and really loved it. You frame it kind of as a Greek tragedy. And I'm kind of interested in how you came away after all the research you did. Other authors you can see with Nixon at times, sometimes they come away more harshly perhaps than they had before. Tim Weiner's book is very harsh. I felt like Evan Thomas's book, he came away more sympathetic, maybe Jack Farrell a little bit too. How did you come away feeling about Nixon differently after spending all this time listening to him? He was in your head as you're listening to these tapes and reading the transcripts.
Well, it's true. I spent a lot of time with Nixon, and I physically followed him around the White House from room to room. For me, it was the best part of 2 years. But I think I could probably find my way around the Nixon White House in the dark. It's not quite the same today as it was back in those days. But when you do that as a biographer, and probably you feel the same way, having written biographies of people like former Secretary of State Baker, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person you're writing about, and you have to see events from his point of view to a certain extent. And I was forced to do that with Nixon just because, I was immersing myself in all this material and listening to him. So that didn't exactly make me more sympathetic to Nixon, but it did make me more empathetic, I think. There's a difference between sympathy and empathy. I was forced to see things from his point of view. And in the process, he became less of a liberal caricature to me and more of a real human being, with his own tragic flaw and his own pain that he felt at, losing everything that he had achieved in his life. And, for example, the relations with members of his family. And most of the Nixon Watergate books don't go into the same degree of depth that I do of conversations with his family. And you really see there the pain that they felt, the pain that Nixon felt. And whatever you think of Nixon politically, that certainly humanizes him as a person.
I'm glad to pick up on this, because I do think you're right. First of all, you mentioned, and I must tell the audience, for those who haven't read the book yet, Michael isn't kidding when he says he literally is in the physical environment of the Nixon White House and putting himself in, Nixon as he experiences this, and trying to not just listen to the tapes, but actually to contextualize, well, where were they? When did this take place? So that's really where I learned things, right? It's not even so much like, well, Nixon directed the cover up, that kind of revelation. You know, to me, it was understanding, for example, that much of what we think of as Nixon directing the cover up or the key moments in the Watergate investigation as it unfolded, that many of them were taking place not in the Oval Office, for example, but actually next door to the White House in the OEOB. And I did not realize that, or I never understood until you took the time to explain it in this, how the taping occurred. Like, why would Richard Nixon be doing the idiotic thing of taping himself at every inopportune moment, as opposed to just when he chose to do so, and explaining it in the way that we understand that it's a classic screw up, and the government really didn't know how to do it, but the president ordered that they should do it. And so then they come up with this kind of like technological fix, and they're not able to kind of like make it do all the things he wants. And then they basically all just like, well, screw it, you know, this is what we got. And that made so much sense to me, right? Like, because if you pull back and ask these basic questions, right, which is the true journalist thing that a lot of people don't understand. Like, not only is it okay to ask like basic questions or stupid questions, but like usually those give you the best answers. So on the tapes, this is a very interesting question. You immersed yourself in them. A lot of people have been mining them and listening to them, historians in recent years. What do you feel like you got out of the tapes that was new and different?
Right. Well, the problem of the tapes are both a blessing and a curse for biographers or historians, because there's so much of them that, you know, say Jack Farrell's biography of Nixon is an excellent book, but he could only scratch on the surface with this extraordinary material. So that's why I had to condense the time frame to just a few months in order to exploit this extraordinary resource and follow Nick, you know, create one scene, then another scene, and at this particularly dramatic moment when the whole thing is falling apart. Now, what we should tell people about the tapes is that previous presidents had taped themselves. I mean, Kennedy taped himself, LBJ taped himself, but they all turned on the tape recorders themselves.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, LBJ, it was when he made telephone calls. Nixon, it was Kennedy, it was mainly in the cabinet room, but they had control over the tape recorder machine. In the case of Nixon, because Nixon was a bit of a klutz and nobody trusted him and he didn't trust himself to turn the machines on. So they turned themselves on automatically and recorded absolutely everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And as a result, we have this whole sort of stream of consciousness of real life from different parts of the White House and Camp David that, you know, is absolutely unique and give you a window into how a president operates that, you know, it's impossible is ever going to be repeated again. And in order to make use of this, I thought I had to focus on a relatively short period of time, because then you could really get inside the room and create these scenes. And had I tried to describe all of Watergate or all of Nixon's life, I'd have quickly got lost in the, you know, in the weeds.
No, I think you're right, actually. I mean, the 100 days from his inauguration, when he's just won this smashing re-election, this extraordinary validation of his presidency, to having to fire, you know, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean, or is this such a stunning fall from grace that I think that to focus on that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a very riveting. So what's your favorite story from the book? Or one of your favorite stories? I thought, by the way, you mentioned the family, the parts with Julie I thought were great, or really interesting. I didn't know some of that stuff about how she was trying to you know, prop up her father in these worst of moments, even as they themselves, as you say, were suffering. Tell us one of your favorite stories from the book that we haven't heard or people might not be familiar with.
Well, Andrea mentioned, I mean, this is, you know, there are little nuggets there that you'd have never heard of before. I mean, for example, I came across a memo in the Nixon White Library out in Yorba Linda, which was written by one of Nixon's aides, who was alarmed by B.B. Rebozo's habit of driving Nixon off into the boondocks. And B.B. Rebozo, if you remember, was one of Nixon's two great buddies. And Nixon loved spending time with him, largely because Rebozo was a great listener and brooded well, as one of Nixon's aides put it, with Nixon. But anyway, he would drive Nixon off into the boondocks, much to the alarm of the Secret Service, who thought it was dangerous, and of the aides who, this was during the early years of the nuclear briefcase, sometimes they would lose contact and they'd have to send up a helicopter to track the pair down. And there was, this memo talks about had Nixon needed to launch a nuclear strike, he would have had to stop at a gas station in order to phone it in. I mean, that's fairly extraordinary. There are lots of episodes like that, but it's some of the sort of just the human detail of his rivalry with Kissinger. There's the night of the, he gives a big party at the White House, actually the largest party that's ever been given in the White House for returning Vietnam POWs. And they throw the White House open to them. There's a big marquee on the lawn. It's the great triumphant success from Nixon's point of view. And then he retires to his favorite room in the White House, which is the Lincoln sitting room on the second floor in the residence, the smallest room in the White House. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. And there's such a striking contrast for him between the euphoria of this event and the dreary reality of Watergate, the drip, drip, drip. And there's 1 o'clock in the morning, he calls his daughters into the room, Julie and Trish, and starts wondering whether he should resign, and calls Al Haig. And we have the recording of his conversation with Al Haig. It's sort of tragic, but I mean, that scene, I've never seen that scene written up before. And it really captures, the human anguish that Nixon was going through at the time.
One of the things is that you made this decision to unfold the book chronologically, right? And you're putting this moment in time. And in part, obviously, you just pointed out it's because of the tapes themselves and this incredible volume of material, and how else could you? But I'm wondering, like, what else you got from having a tight chronological focus? Right. Like, what is the benefit of chronology versus, kind of the broad sweep of, like, we already knew that the complicated personal dynamics, for example, that, were swirling around Nixon, or his, you see here in this account, his growing suspicion of John Dean and realization, belatedly, that Dean is going to betray him. What else do you learn from having it unfold as a chronology?
Right. Well, I'm a great believer in historical narrative, and that means a very strong sense of chronology and of time moving forward. I think it's, the best way to tell the story, simply. There's no better way of organizing a history book or a biography than chronology. So I don't see why people, choose any other system of organization. But from the point of view of understanding, I think it's very important to tell history as it was actually lived, because, it was Kierkegaard who said, I think, that, history is understood backwards, but lived forwards. Mm. And it's always a temptation for historians to, second guess 40, 50 years later, but that actually is not the way history unfolds, as you know very well, as being observers of the White House and other huge historical events. History is actually experienced forwards, and people don't have the hindsight that historians have. So I think it's important to make that point. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I also wrote about, is has us all on the edge of our seats, because at the time we didn't know what the outcome was. Now, of course, we do. And we know that Nixon resigned, but I still think you can create a sense of excitement and drama by telling the story forward rather than backwards. And I think it's also a more honest way to, gain historical insights into the mindsets of the people who are of the principal actors.
You, of course, have characters in here in addition to Nixon, and it's their interactions with him that become part of the play, in effect, right? As you're presenting it in almost dramatic terms. What did you think about Haldeman and Ehrlichman as you were revealed to them through these tapes? And history remembers them as the Prussian Guard, as sort of the henchmen, in effect, of Nixon. But as you present them, there's a sort of, the reader anyway is left with kind of a empathy, if not sympathy, for these characters who seem to be, in their own way, jousting with Nixon over who's going to take the fall, especially Ehrlichman, who seems to resent it even more than Haldeman. What did you come away thinking about these two men?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is partly a portrait of the American equivalent of a medieval court, because, an American president is like a medieval king surrounded by all these courtiers telling him what a wonderful person he is, and trying to anticipate his every wish. So the two key people around Nixon, as you mentioned, were Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They sound a bit like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, but they're both Germans, and they're very different people. I mean, Haldeman, he had this fearsome reputation as the man who, whipped everybody into shape, but he was tremendously loyal to Nixon. He, sacrificed his own career, his family, to his service for Nixon. Haldeman is one of the people I came to have a much greater respect for as I researched this book. And he also left behind an extraordinary diary. Every night he kept an audio diary of events in the day, which, next to the tapes, is the most valuable source on the Nixon presidency. And when it finally came, the crisis erupted over Watergate, Haldeman's thought was always for the good of the presidency, the good of the country. He didn't try to struggle to maintain his position, or at least not very much. This is in contrast to Ehrlichman, who, felt that he had been shafted by Nixon. And there's some very emotional scenes between Nixon and Ehrlichman, in which Ehrlichman is essentially accusing Nixon of being the author of all their misfortunes and being the real originator of Watergate, and basically telling the president that he should be the one to resign, not either Nixon and Ehrlichman. By the way, there's an extraordinary scene in the book when, on Air Force One, when they're flying down to Mississippi to inspect some flood damage. And this is just at the most dramatic moment of Watergate, when they're about to, it's probably pretty clear that both Haldeman and Ehrlichman are going to have to go. And they bring the plane down to about 10,000 feet to inspect the flood damage. And Ehrlichman, who's the domestic policy advisor, goes into the cockpit of Air Force One. And for a few minutes, he thinks of crashing the plane and staging a murder-suicide. And, he calculates his chances, and then he thinks about it for a bit and then goes back to his seat. But, that shows the personal drama that they were all living through at the time. Several of them thought of committing suicide, including Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Nixon himself prayed at night that he wouldn't wake up in the morning a couple of times. So, there's a political drama here, but there's a human drama as well. And Haldeman and Ehrlichman are part of it, definitely.
So I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, this emotional toll, both on Nixon and that he wreaks on others. in the last few years, obviously, we haven't brought up the T word yet here, but let's do it. You know, the Trump word, I mean, by the T word. It's very interesting in that there have been endless comparisons and every different variety of them between Trump and Nixon, especially because the Trump presidency has now ended in such a spectacular fashion. And, you know, talk about the unmaking of the presidency. It's hard to find a more dramatic period in American politics in Washington than, you know, from November 3rd of 2020 through January 6th and to January 20th of this year. Trump versus Nixon, you know, I'm curious, first of all, what you think. You know, I know a lot of people, I've spoken with people, even people who were on Nixon's enemies list, who say that Trump was worse. But I'm interested in particular in your views on the human part of the presidency, right? Like Trump's superpower in many ways was always his brazenness, his willingness to say in public the kinds of things that Nixon was quoted on the tapes as saying only in private. Arguably, Nixon stepped down because he still had some sense of shame. And I'm just curious how you would contrast what we've just been through with what you've seen in terms of the emotional cost of the presidency on Nixon.
Right. Well, one can see Nixon suffer during this period, and that's part of what makes him a tragic figure, in my view. I mean, I haven't seen, perhaps others will discover it, but I haven't seen any evidence of Trump suffering as a result of what he put the country through. I also think there's a richness to Nixon's family life that I haven't seen in Trump's. But, you know, quite apart from all that, I mean, many people may have thought of Nixon as the worst president in US history. I put him in a completely different category to Trump. I think Nixon was, for all his faults, even his crimes, he was within the mainstream of American presidents. And I say that partly because you know, he never contested an election. There was a very close election in 1960 when he had much more cause to contest that election than Trump did the last election. And certainly, but Nixon, you know, he swallowed that. He resented it. He was angry about it, and it certainly shaped his later, you know, behavior. He thought he was determined never to be outdone by the Kennedys and the Democrats again, but he did not contest the election. And to me, that and in the end, you know, when he was reached an impasse in the presidency and the Supreme Court ruled against him, and it was clear that he had to give up the tapes, you know, he resigned. Of course, he wasn't happy about that either, but he did it with a modicum of grace and dignity. His farewell speech to the White House staff the day before he resigned, some people made fun of it. I find it a very moving occasion. So I put Nixon in a completely different category to Trump. Also, you know, he was a much more substantive, serious person than Trump. He had a great understanding of American history. He read a lot, a very sophisticated understanding of politics. I think it was Karl Marx, not Groucho Marx, who said that history repeats itself the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And to me, that describes a little bit Nixon and Trump. I don't think what we've seen the last, I mean, I wouldn't be writing a book that says American tragedy, you know, applying it to Trump about the events of the last few months. I mean, I know that you're
what
working on
call it? We're in the market for a title.
Perhaps an American farce. I don't know. I mean, there's. I mean, I find Trump unique, partly because of the events of the last few months. I mean, there's a lot that. I mean, I'm by no means sort of in the category of Trump haters or, you know, objecting to some of the things he did as president. I mean, some of I can make sort of balanced judgments, but everything that happened from the election to January the 20th, I thought was completely beyond the pale and puts him in a different category to any other president, including Nixon.
Right. I think that's a fair point. And it's interesting to look at Trump as taking what happened to Nixon and then putting it on steroids in effect. Like
Right.
the guardrail, there were guardrails, right, with Nixon that seem to have disappeared by the time we get to now. One thing that was really interesting to me, Michael, was after I wrote a book about the Clinton impeachment, which of course was the impeachment between the Nixon and the twin Trump impeachments. And Clinton refused to resign. He refused to give in to his enemies. He's basically dared them to push him out. He knew he could make it partisan and therefore and that the other side was, of course, also making it partisan that he could survive. Nixon chose not to do that. Susan said there was, in the end, a sense of shame, it seems, on Nixon's part, where he does, throw himself on the sword. And I interviewed Howard Baker and Fred Thompson when I did the Clinton book, both of whom, of course, played major roles in Watergate. And both of them said that having watched Clinton, they now thought that perhaps Nixon might have actually been able to survive had he bowled it out. That even though he'd been told he would lose, in the Senate, that it's possible that he could have, but that the difference between Nixon and Clinton, and certainly with Trump, was that Nixon was willing to basically accept the shame of what he had done unwillingly, reluctantly, obviously, but that he did in some way know he had done wrong and accepted the consequences for it.
Right. I don't think that Nixon could have survived after the tapes came out. I think had he burned the tapes, had he destroyed the tapes, he would have completed his presidency. But once the tapes came out, the Supreme Court ordered their release. I think that was a smoking gun that the president had. Nixon probably didn't order Watergate, but he did order the cover-up, and the tapes proved that. There was much more evidence against Nixon in the impeachment proceedings than there was either against Clinton or Trump, largely because of these tapes. You have to remember that the whole Nixon impeachment investigation process took the best part of 18 months or so, perhaps almost 2 years. There was a level of investigation into Nixon that there never was with Trump. Personally, I think the Democrats made a mistake because they had 2 impeachments without the level of detailed investigation that had required a level of proof, to get rid of a president. And certainly the amount of evidence accumulated against Nixon was far in excess and far more authoritative than anything produced against Trump. And that was Trump's, what really saved Trump, that, most people would consider him guilty of impeachable offenses, or many people would, but there wasn't the degree of sort of open and shut evidence that there had been in the case of Nixon to convince a bipartisan majority that he was guilty of impeachable crimes.
You don't think the perfect phone call was
the perfect phone call?
But it's interesting, right? Because that was like something that Trump himself released, but then it didn't come with all the other records. And part of what Trump did, by the way, was not just, he actively obstructed congressional investigations as well. I do think that is another point to make, right? Like that is a difference between the Nixon era and the Trump era, is that the Trump administration literally just simply refused to comply with any subpoenas.
But just purely in terms of time, you had over a year of this investigations going and then it went all the way to the Supreme Court to get evidence. It wasn't as though Nixon just volunteered these tapes. He fought it all the way, all through a Saturday night massacre. So it took a long period of time, and it was a kind of drip, drip, drip. It didn't happen in 2 weeks or a couple of months. It took 18 months.
No, it's such a good point. Now, we should note to the audience, we do want to take questions as well. And our friends, the organizers here, have said we should prod you to the best way is not to use this Zoom chat, but send your questions to reservations@writersblockpresents.com. That's reservations@writersblockpresents.com. And then Michael promises to answer them with pithy, brilliant answers.
And so, I'll do my best.
With that expectation setting. Before we get to that, though, I mean, let's flip it around. Rather than put Trump in the Nixon category, how does Nixon fit today? How would he do in today's political environment? Because he seems, in so many ways, a different kind of Republican. And as you point out, a substantive figure, a person of actual accomplishments that were important to the country, even as his own failings brought him down. That's one of the things that makes Nixon so fascinating, of course, is it because the Watergate doesn't completely define him. It's the contrast between Watergate and the opening to China, or the creation of the EPA, or all these different things that people could credit him for. How would Nixon do in today's political environment?
Right. Well, in some ways, he represented a completely different Republican Party that you mentioned. I mean, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is a good example of that. I mean, some liberals consider Nixon a liberal president domestically in some respects, but you can see a direct link between Nixon's politics and Trump's politics. So when I compared Nixon, I mean, I think there's some points of contrast, which I've mentioned, but there are also some similarities. I mean, partly their rhetoric they used, the fact that they made a political career or a political movement out of their hatred of the Eastern establishment, the elites. I mean, it was Nixon that started that. Nixon put himself at the head of what he called the silent majority, speaking out against the counterculture of the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War people. So I think you can, some of Nixon's Southern strategy, his playing of the race card to peel away parts of the Democratic electorate, that all started in the Nixon period and is a constant going right through to Trump. This whole thing of identity politics, it was Nixon who first started wearing the American flag in his lapel. So in some sense, I think Nixon would be very at home in today's politics. I mean, no one was better than Nixon of kind of whipping up a crowd against the smug Eastern elite. And Trump, whether he's done this consciously or not, has certainly taken a leaf out of Nixon's political playbook. But that said, as Nixon was a more substantive president. He, for example, in foreign policy, I mean, he had a real sort of sense of strategy and how to play the pawns on the global chessboard in a way that I at least sort of felt that, Trump was just making it up as he went along. In some ways, Nixon, he's a character from this age of bipartisanship, but he also set in motion some of the political forces that have resulted in today's, very divisive politics.
Yeah, it's an excellent point about, Nixon's harnessing of a sort of proto-populist rhetoric when it came to things like, running against Washington or the Eastern elites. And yet he himself was obviously not exactly a man of the people, even though he came from a much more modest background or even an impoverished background relative to Donald Trump's. You said something interesting, which is that it really, for you, despite all the controversies of the last 4 years, that it really was from November 3rd on and the rigged election challenge that Trump launched that really made him, as a historian, in your view, in a different category of president than Nixon. I know this isn't in the frame of your book, but do you think it's because politics changed that Richard Nixon did not challenge the election of 1960, or because he was just fundamentally a different person than Donald Trump? This is sort of Peter's point.
Yeah.
right? Like this is kind of Peter's question. Like, if Richard Nixon was president today, would he have just said, screw it? Like I'm going to refuse to leave.
Well, possibly. But yeah, I mean, that was the norm that, he played by what were considered the rules of the game for a very long time. And the most sacrosanct of all those rules of the game is that you didn't challenge the results of the election. I mean, that didn't mean that he didn't think that he could pull a few dirty tricks and organize a few break-ins, because, he was determined not to be outmaneuvered, as he saw it, by the Democrats again. So that gave him a thirst for political intelligence, which is one of the reasons for Watergate. I mean, the White House, from Nixon to Haldeman, then to the committee to re-elect the president, were putting pressure on people like Jeb Magruder, who ran the committee to re-elect the president, to produce more and more intelligence. And it was Nixon that was, he was that played to Nixon's wishes. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to pretend that Nixon wasn't the author of all these dirty tricks and he didn't break the law, but he respected the most important rules of the game, which is that you respect the result of the election and you go when your time is up, and you hand over power in a dignified manner to your successor. So I guess there's sort of big rules of the game and smaller infractions, of which he was certainly guilty.
I think your point about his speech on the day he leaves office actually is totally right, where he talks about how you can't give in to hate, because if you do, hate will destroy you. It's this moment of seeming self-awareness of what his own deep, dark flaws had done to bring him down. And of course, you don't see that too many presidents, the self-awareness of just how their own demons, take away from the what they would like to see as the great heroic aspects of their presidency. One last quick question. We'll turn it over to Andrea for the audience questions, but you said that it wasn't just Watergate. Remind the audience a little bit, because you do in the book, about, for instance, the Pentagon Papers, which is 50 years ago this month, and the Daniel Ellsberg. And what role does that play in setting the stage for what these 100 days that you chronicle?
Exactly. Well, I don't think Watergate would have happened without, first of all, the Vietnam War, the whole culture of the anti-war movement, and also the Pentagon Papers, which actually was a secret history of the Vietnam War that didn't incriminate Nixon himself. But Nixon and Kissinger got each other so worked up about this that they felt that they had to plug these leaks. And that was the origin of this so-called plumbers unit in the basement, actually not of the White House, but of the executive office building next door, to which people like Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt were recruited. And actually, Nixon could probably have got away with Watergate had it just been a one-off scandal. The problem was that the same gang that broke into the Watergate had previously, been part of this plumbers unit that was trying to plug other leaks and trying to blacken the reputation of the leak of the Pentagon Papers by going into his burglarizing his psychiatrist's office out in LA. And so that they felt necessary to cover up. So when the question came of could they shift the blame for Watergate onto people at the committee to re-elect the president, and that would have been the most sensible strategy for them to have pursued. But they felt they couldn't do that because any serious investigation into Watergate would have immediately linked those burglars to the people who had, tried to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and it would open up a whole can of worms that would jeopardize Nixon's re-election campaign. And that was the basic reason for the cover-up. So there's an intimate connection between the Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, and Watergate, and probably Watergate would not have happened without those two preceding events.
So Andrea, yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I have some questions from the audience. You've, all of you have answered several of them, but I know that we're in good shape. Were Pence, Agnew, and Gerald Ford similar as yes men to the presidents they served?
Well, all vice presidents are yes men to the presidents they serve. I mean, that's the job of the vice president. And so are people around the president. I mean, with varying degrees of being yes men. I mean, actually, it's very interesting in the case of Nixon and probably all presidents. I mean, some are more yes men than others, and some try to restrain the president. I mean, Haldeman acted as a kind of restraint on the president at times. Chuck Colson, who we haven't mentioned, was Nixon's hatchet man, who believed in immediately fulfilling any of Nixon's dark wishes or orders. As for Agnew, I mean, Agnew was going through his own trials at this point. He was being investigated for corruption as governor of Maryland. And Nixon used to joke that his best insurance policy against assassination was Spiro Agnew, because however bad people thought Nixon was, having Agnew replace him was even worse. And, Nixon used to joke about that. And he often used to talk to his aides. He would say, when the idea might come up of his own resignation, he would say, "Do you want Agnew?" And of course, the answer was always no. So Agnew eventually resigned, gave way to Gerald Ford, which certainly removed one obstacle to Nixon's own resignation, because we knew we would get at least an honest president after that. But comparing, I mean, I think probably if I had to rank vice presidents, I'd put Agnew lower down than Pence, partly because Pence, at the crucial moment, he fulfilled his constitutional duties. I mean, whatever else you thought of Pence, at the key moment, he upheld the Constitution and the transition of power. I mean, Agnew was never tested in that way. He was forced to resign because he was about to be indicted.
And didn't Agnew suggest to Nixon that Nixon burn the tapes?
Right, he did. I mean, there's a dramatic scene in my book when this is just after the existence of the tape recording machine has been revealed by Alexander Butterfield in Congress. And actually Nixon is in the Naval Hospital here near where I live in Bethesda, Maryland, same place that Trump was taken to with COVID a few months ago. And Nixon is having to face this decision of should he destroy the tapes or should he keep the tapes, and he's getting different sets of advice. Agnew says you should organize a bonfire on the White House lawn and get rid of them all. And Nixon, his mind was a bit cloudy. He still thought that the tapes could serve as possible. He could use the tapes, leak them selectively, perhaps. He didn't calculate that, the most incriminating tapes would be subpoenaed by the Supreme Court and released publicly. That just didn't enter his mind at that time. And of course, it was a fatal miscalculation because it was really those tapes that eventually brought him down.
I want to add that people can listen to Nixon tapes on Michael Dobbs' website. It's really fascinating listening to John Dean, talk about the cancer on the presidency and Henry Kissinger. It's just great. It's on michaeldobbsbooks.com, I believe, /Nixon.
/tapes, yep.
Yes.
Also, the audio book has extracts from the tapes. So you hear the conversation, the narrator describing the conversation, and then you can actually listen to the extracts from the tapes. And there's nothing like it to, you can not capture intonations and the way Nixon actually talked with, I think we had a pretty good narrator, but the narrator can't sort of capture the full color of Nixon, speaking for himself on these tapes.
And speaking of John Dean has emerged as a heroic figure from the Nixon administration. For those of us who are too young to know, who were the others who chose country over party?
Right. Well, I wouldn't probably paint Dean in such heroic colors. I mean, I think most people, and this applies to Nixon himself, are best seen in shades of gray rather than black and white. And it's true that Dean was the first to blow the whistle on the cover-up, and it was his actions that led to the unraveling of the Watergate conspiracy. But he also was acting, he can say, for patriotic motives, and no doubt there was some degree of that in his thinking. But he was also acting to save himself, because he realized, and he was probably the first of the Nixon aides to realize, as a trained lawyer, the White House counsel, that he was in dire legal jeopardy. And that was, certainly one of the motivations that led him to turn on Nixon and cooperate with the prosecutors. He really led a double life. He was the Nixon loyalist by day, and then he was talking to the prosecutors at night. Actually, you could say the same thing for another man, Mark Felt, better known as Deep Throat, the deputy director of the FBI, who was writing obsequious memos to the head of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, during the day, and at night he was skulking around parking garages in Washington, talking to our former colleague Bob Woodward. Was Mark Felt a patriot, or was he a traitor who was out? He wanted to become director of the FBI himself, and this was part of the way he thought he might achieve that goal. So many people are a mixture of different motives, some more altruistic than others. I don't think you can ascribe simple motives to most people. I mean, most people are more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Nixon was a self-made man and proved that anyone can become president. We took that too far with Trump, someone who was neither qualified nor competent or morally fit. The Watergate affair ruptured our country. How did we not guard against this happening again? How did we not guard against this at that time from happening again?
Well, there were various safeguards put into place, and one of them was the distance between the Justice Department and the White House, because actually Dean had pretty much an open channel into the Justice Department, and who were reporting the details of the Watergate investigation to him on a day-by-day basis, which helped him manage the cover-up. And it was partly as a result of that there were meant to be various guardrails put in place to put distance between the White House and the Justice Department. But a lot of this just went out the window during the Trump presidency. One of those norms that had actually been a post-Watergate norm was this idea that a president and his aides could not just directly ring up the Justice Department and inquire about, what was happening in investigations.
Right.
But
and
perhaps now it will be bolstered again. This goes in waves.
yeah, and in your book, you have William Peterson, I think, who was an assistant. Wasn't he an assistant attorney general or deputy attorney general? And he would come in every day sycophantically telling the president what was going on.
Exactly. This is after Dean was out of the picture. Then Nixon became, Dean had been what he called himself, the desk officer of the cover-up. And then after Dean it became obvious that Dean was cooperating with the prosecutors, then Nixon himself directly started managing the cover-up, and part of that was to call in the Assistant Attorney General directly in charge of the Watergate investigation and have long talks about him and sort of extract as much information as he could. And this is completely counter to the norms that were later put in place. But at that time, I mean, remember that Robert Kennedy was appointed Attorney General by Jack Kennedy. So in the Kennedy administration, there wasn't much distance between the White House and the Justice Department. And that continued through this entire period of Watergate. And it was only as a result of Watergate that new procedures were put in place that lasted up until the Trump presidency.
I think with this question will be our last. It's probably a good question to end on. What efforts, if any, did Nixon make to rehabilitate his image?
Right.
I mean, he did start the EPA, and he did make some other contributions that are sort of,
right.
that are,
well, the EPA was when he was president. This is the one that's always brought up. But
yeah.
I mean, I call this an American tragedy, and I've compared it to a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy. But in the end, I conclude that this is neither an American a Shakespearean tragedy or a Greek tragedy, because in that type of tragedy, the hero always dies. They always end with the death of the hero. And as we know, the Nixon presidency did not end with the death of Richard Nixon. It led with his resignation, but then he reinvented himself. And he reinvented himself partly during the course of his post-presidency by writing all those books about foreign affairs. I remember when I was in Moscow, he came out on a tour to Moscow and even gave the Washington Post an interview in Moscow as part of his rehabilitation campaign. So this is very American. You reinvent yourself, and Nixon was the master of reinventing himself. So, this in the end is an American story, not a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy. And perhaps that's a good note on which to end.
Right. I mean, and Trump is reinventing himself or continuing to do that now too, which is.
Well, that's true. I mean, we're a nation that reinvents itself all the time, of course. And, I can see many parallels between the greatest novel in American literature, The Great Gatsby, and people like Trump and Nixon, whether you like their reinventions or not. But, there were always new Nixons. This was a joke at the time, actually, that the journalists kept on writing about the new Nixon until they eventually discovered that he just kept on reinventing himself. And he reinvented himself one final time in his post-presidency, and he achieved a remarkable success in his political rehabilitation. His funeral in the National Cathedral was attended by 4 former White House presidents, including Bill Clinton, who said that any president, including Nixon, and he probably thought of himself as well, has to be judged on their whole life, not just a few mistakes. And so Nixon succeeded in this rehabilitation. I mean, it remains to be seen whether Donald Trump will succeed as spectacularly as Nixon did.
Well, thank you so much to all of you, to Michael Dobbs, to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Go to the website to get a copy of this book. It's just such an exciting read, and certainly go to the website and listen to the Nixon tapes. It's remarkable. It's a great contribution to American history and and our understanding of the last 50 years. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much to Peter and Susan for sacrificing some of your Monday evening to
Congratulations, Michael.
this interesting conversation.
Yeah,
Michael, we're thrilled. It's a great book. Go out and buy it.
Congratulations.
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.